Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming out to this afternoon's talk. I keep on wanting to say tonight, but today, it's still daytime. Today's talk is in conjunction with the current exhibition on View, curated by Rachel Pablo, who's here in attendance. I encourage everyone to check out the exhibition if you haven't already, and it's up through December 30th. I'd like to begin with acknowledging, okay, we have one more guest coming in. We have a land acknowledgement that was written by a former board member, Roger Frewa, and I'd like to read from his words. Albuquerque is currently built on the ancestral homelands of the 19 Puebloan nations that was shared with the Mescalero and Hicayuga Apache nations, the Utes, and later the Diné. Their respective ancestors, those living today, and the unborn. This land always has been, is currently, and will always be for the winged, finned, and four-legged. I'd like to acknowledge the sacred living waters and rivers that cross this land. Finally, the sun, the moon, and all the stars and planets that keep our systems in balance. We welcome all. Thank you. So I'd like to introduce our guests. Right next to me is Lehuauakea, whose artwork is right behind us here. Lehuauakea is an interdisciplinary artist and kapa maker from Papaiʻiku, Hawaii. Through a range of traditional Kanaka Maoli craft-based media, their art serves as a means of exploring social and biological ecologies, cultural and environmental resilience, and indigenous identity, breathing new life into patterns and traditions practiced for generations. They recently opened their first curatorial research project, Displace, at the Five Oaks Museum in Portland, Oregon. Also joining us is Dr. Alexis Salas, an endowed professor of the arts in the Americas and art history at the University of Arkansas, and has a PhD in art history from the University of Texas at Austin, with a specialization in Latin and Latinx art and visual culture. She is an art historian of global and modern contemporary art with a specialization in the Americas. Her curatorial projects, courses, and scholarship explore fine art as well as visual and material culture, and emphasize the voices of people of color as well as feminist and queer critique. And we also have Dr. Estevan Rael-Gálvez, who's an anthropologist, historian, and cultural consultant who has served as the former Senior Vice President at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Executive Director at the National Hispanic Cultural Center, and as the State Historian of New Mexico. He is currently the Executive Director of Native-Bound Unbound, Archive of the Indigenous Enslaved, a digital initiative supported by the Mellon Foundation with the goal of documenting Indigenous slavery across the Americas. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to begin this conversation, which is good on shapeshifting and assimilation. We're going to explore multiple modes of how this topic relates to this exhibition. The need to shift within spaces or to assimilate can shift itself depending on the geopolitics of the time and the background of the individuals involved. So some of the artworks in the exhibition address cultural assimilation directly, and some are informed by their practice, and others perhaps act in opposition to it by utilizing forms of refusal. In the case of this installation right here, to my right and your left, by Gabriel Maestas, they explore the Hanisero people's hidden identity and their artist's own personal lineage. So the Hanisero people, in case if you're not familiar, are descendants of enslaved indigenous people and are of mixed indigenous and European descent. They've often needed to shift within spaces and hide or refuse aspects of their racial identity. So I wanted to engage Dr. Rael-Gálvez. Given your project Native-Bound Unbound, can you talk about how and why the act of hiding or refusing one's own identity might be critical to survival and self-preservation, and how that's led to gaps in historical records and erasure?
Should I? use a mic. I can project. If I can
I believe we turned it off right before starting, so there's a button right at the bottom.
Right here.
Thank you.
Maybe. Is that on? No, maybe not. There we go.
Okay, that was a deep question right away. Just way to write it, jumped into the water. Could you restate the last part?
Yes, certainly. Of course, considering your project Native Bound and Unbound, I'm interested in how and why the act of hiding or refusing one's own identity is critical to survival and self-preservation, specifically in case of the Hanisado people or Mestizo people. One of the themes that's in this piece, they explore their lineage's kind of refusal of their indigenous identity as like kind of an act of survival against the United States government's policies. And I'm just curious if you could expound on that.
There's so many ways to enter that conversation. And the words that you have used, in particular, hiding. I also think of being hidden and how people have been represented, right? How indigenous enslaved, regardless of what categories have been ascribed to them in the archive, a whole other imperial imposition, and as represented in this piece, particularly mestizo, all of the caste categories, have actually obscured them, which is precisely what I think this piece is speaking to and reclaiming, or sort of putting to the forefront and recognizing the heaviness. But because you started with the word hiding, it makes me think of when I started this work professionally, because I think I started the work of recovering indigenous enslavement when I started watching Roots and listening to ancestors grandmothers tell the stories of indigenous people who were enslaved at the age of 6 when Roots was coming out. But professionally, when I started recovering this project, it was hard. It was a very different moment when people were not comfortable talking about those ancestors. And the backlash was, we're starting to see that again though, but the backlash of not wanting to talk about those stories was much more prevalent than it is now. We've seen a change in momentum. The fact that there's a Hanisado movement in New Mexico, and in many ways a global recovery of these untold stories really speaks to the difference. When I started doing that was the early 1990s. And one anecdote, a story. I had just finished doing an interview in the San Luis Valley of southern Colorado of an elder who was already in his 90s. And he went to the back, took out a handkerchief. "This is all I have left of my grandfather," he said, who was a Diné man who had been captured, and this is all I have left of him, and the story that he proceeded to unfold in the same way that he was unfolding this handkerchief. And a beautiful, powerful story, and he was weeping, telling me, and I knew that it was hard, and it felt like, it couldn't have been, but it felt like it was the first time that he was telling that story. Like he was hiding him or uncovering it. Finished up the interview, went outside when his granddaughter, a young Chicana who had grown up in Denver, drove up. And like all of us from these communities, she turned to me and wanted to know, who are you and what are you doing here, right? You have to begin introducing yourself, saying what people and place you belong to, saying, why are you interviewing my grandfather? So I introduced myself and said who I was, said I had grown up less than 30 miles away from there. And I told her what I was doing, and the beautiful story that her grandfather had just said, "I guess that doesn't sound so good for our people," she said. And I leaned into the story. She said that we come from Indians and slaves. And it was a reminder to me how complicated it is to recover these stories, even ethnographically. So whether it's ethnographically, archivally, or otherwise, the fact that we now have artists who are in many ways creatively drawing from that well and taking words like mestizo, criado, genízaro and re-inscribing them, reimagining them here or globally, I think speaks to the difference from when I was gathering those stories, when people still were not comfortable talking about that, to now. You asked a very different question, but I've talked enough. You asked about the moment when they were hiding, and I think that's a different thing, but I don't want to talk so much.
No, I think that really addresses a lot of different things that I was considering. One of them being how you can see there being these big gaps that you then now have to go out and investigate in kind of cultural history. But artists working with this as subject matter had led me to a question that I had for Dr. Salas about art functioning as, or possibly functioning. I wanted to know what your experience or thoughts were as a different form of archive where there might be gaps in historical records, but maybe one could look through art history and different artists working, whether intentionally or not, and be able to trace personal experience or record in that way.
Yeah. And this question of hiding, I think, also runs through in the sense that I think a lot of artists are doing work that's really about strategic positioning, and I wanted to sort of bring up the question of agency in cultural production, and the idea of who gets to hear the histories or the stories and when. Art is a really interesting space of public articulation, and so I sometimes think about what my grandmother once told me about don't give pearls to the pigs. Like that is only certain contexts or situations allow for something to be understood. And so this question of hiding, which could seem passive or submissive, I think is actually a really powerful position to think about what you want to reveal to whom and when, who has the right to hear your story or to be part of the legacy. And this question of what it is to articulate a word or a category or an identity, as we're talking about cultural assimilation, seems really relevant, and that these types of naming, which can be violent and constricting, of identity categories, they can be predatory, particularly as how they've been enacted in the art world as curators or institutions want to tick boxes and make sure they've covered all the bases. So they can have this predatory nature of did you cover all the categories? But they can also be these sites of liberation where we find words through which we can connect to others, through ways that we can understand ourselves and our practices and form communities. So I think the idea of how artists can link to these questions of cultural assimilation, particularly when so much of their work has been made trends of, allows us to kind of think about the work that artists do to be subversive, to create counter archives. You mentioned that the imperial nature or the colonial nature of the archive, which I think is so true. And also there are wonderful ways that people pass on traditions and ideas to one another through cultural production that allow us completely different understandings of what history is, how we share and are in community with one another. Yeah, and sort of in terms of my practice, I've tried to start thinking about, so I'm an academic, I teach at a university, we're supposed to write articles and books, which is part and parcel of what we have to do. But I've also wanted to start thinking about ways that that project can be amplified, and how artists and cultural producers can offer us new methodologies. So through one exhibition that I worked on, we created a counter archive online, so people could upload materials. They could sort of set the pace of what things were and create a history that's not just about what we as art historians have discovered or decide to talk about, but kind of a larger cultural history of a specific moment. And I'm really interested in those kinds of projects as well.
That's really interesting, and I'm going to circle back to a couple things that you brought up that will definitely come up in conversation, but I also want to talk to Lehuauakea as an artist, and thinking about all of these themes. I was interested, since you've exhibited kind of all over, and you have a show in Australia, I believe, coming up, or already, both. I was interested in how your work is perceived or received in different areas, like let's say Hawaii as opposed to New Mexico here, or elsewhere, like in Portland, and if you've noticed a different understanding or perception of your work, and if that has at all informed your work.
Yeah, I think that is a pretty deep question. In some ways it might imply that the way that I move as an individual and an artist would be informed or perhaps different depending on my context. And I think in some ways maybe, but not to the point of hiding myself or assimilating to erase parts of myself that are intrinsically me or intrinsically Hawaiian. Location-wise, I think, of course, back home in Hawaii, my work is perceived differently than perhaps here or elsewhere on the continent, just because it is coming from that place. A lot of the people who are audience members in those gallery and museum and kind of those sorts of settings back home, a lot of them share similar experiences or are also Native Hawaiian. And so they are looking at it through a very different view, much different lens than someone who might be non-Native or not Native Hawaiian at all, which in turn is kind of a lot of the audience that I have here on the continent, especially in a city like you mentioned, Portland, which I believe is still the most demographically white city in the US. I don't know if that's changed at all. I know demographics there are changing quite a bit, but at least when I was living there and up until the last few years, it was a very white-centric city, and that included most of the audience that I engaged with in spaces like museums and galleries with my art. And so I think in places like Portland, I and my work became objects of tokenization. Like Alexis mentioned, the idea of checking off institutional boxes for diversity, because in Portland there really isn't a large visibility for Native people. The population is there, but perhaps not as large or as visible as in a place like New Mexico. So I think the way that my work is allowed to move and operate definitely changes depending on place and the context of all of that. And so on the other hand, though, I don't really feel like I, as an artist, consciously make decisions to maybe censor or erase what I otherwise want to talk about within my work. I think my work is just what it is. Yeah, does that kind of?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And like kind of speaking about that, I have a question for everyone, and always feel free to comment on each other's. But I'm curious about if you feel that the art world, which, you know, museums, galleries, cultural institutions, and even the kind of education that surrounds that, do you feel that the art world perpetuates the need for groups, marginalized groups, to culturally assimilate? And I'm keeping in mind the types of boxes that we were talking about, the different the ways that certain identities are categorized as indigenous or Latinx, or even modes of practice as contemporary versus traditional, and how that's all negotiated in these spaces. Yeah. So.
If I may. Yeah, the art world will always try to use us. That's sort of I think the game that we all have to accept is at play. But I think the more interesting series of questions is, how do we use it? And there are so many artists who are using it in interesting, playful ways, who will persist in making the work that they have always wanted to make, but they will find the ways to insert themselves in a system that is inherently flawed, that is racist, xenophobic, homophobic. We could go on and on, right? But these strategies of subversion, I think, are the real basis. And I don't think, I mean, one could label and say that there's cultural assimilation happening, but there's also all of these other elements that are always at play. And the artwork has this incredible capacity to subvert from within, to find its way into an institution and continue to transmit messages through iconographies, through symbolism, through the way that it's reenacted, through the way that it's placed in new spaces, to undo the systems, critique the systems that it's more or less part of. And I find those moments really exciting and inspiring, but maybe it's also a good moment to have a conversation, and you posed this question, which I thought was so fruitful, about like how we can all think about how we could use the art world better, or what are even strategies of confronting and facing the cultural assimilation that will always be asked, right? So maybe, if it's okay, I'll start that question and see if others have some thoughts as well. But one of my first thoughts about how one navigates cultural assimilation is that institutions need to stop asking for free labor. And they need to stop posing work as an opportunity. And yeah, and in terms of just some very like brass tacks kind of thoughts about that, if people are familiar with Wage for Work, that's a great website that has a fee calculator. Because one of the ways I see this enacted is that people are asked for their rates all the time, even though there's already a budget that exists, and so it's kind of this weird lowballing of artists and cultural producers when they already know how much money they have, and there are these structures to figure out how much someone should be paid. So I just want to make sure everyone knows about Wage for Work and other tools. And I mean, maybe to encourage all of us too, there's so many taboos around money and wages, and for all of us to share as much as possible how much people should be paid. Because I do think that that's one of the kind of quiet ways that people are contained, is that money is this taboo, and there's, you know, the art world is so prestigious, and simply being invited into it is in and of itself a great opportunity, and I think we need to start undoing that. So I don't know if you, yeah, I don't know if that opens conversations about how we do that.
I study colonialism and how the empire created these institutions to begin with that were not meant to represent us, or that were not meant to have us at the table in the quite this way that we have insisted, that we have strategized, that we have placed ourselves in those roles, either as artists or curators, as archivists. I mean, so we've not been in control of those positions for the longest time. But I love the idea, I love the accentuating the strategies to reclaim those spaces, right? Like that is part of these processes, and we've started to do that. But if you did an assessment of all of these cultural institutions, museums, galleries, markets, all of them, you will still see an imbalance. We know that imbalance continues to exist, but we have to keep pushing our way in there and actually realize that we have to make space for all of those continuing behind us, right? So those are the strategies I'm always thinking about. But, you know, just as we have to rethink the museum, how it was first intended, I'm always thinking of the archive. And, you know, there are strategies that have, you know, I think of Emma Perez's work around the decolonial imaginary. Right? And how so many Chicanas and indigenous women have had to reimagine ourselves in those spaces. But I also think that we have not tapped enough of what's in there. I mean, one of the things I really love about the project, if I may, Native Bound Unbound, is we are recovering name by name. No, they're not our original names, but they're the names that they held and they passed down to their children. And name by name, document by document, we are incorporating them into the project. And we're doing it almost with the intention to recognize that there are descendants out there that will find them, right? For me, that's a driving force. It's been a driving force since I was little, so that people can actually look in there and say, well, I think my grandmother's name was maybe Josefa, maybe she lived in Mora, maybe she lived in Hawaii. You know, finding those individuals and recognizing that we have to contextualize that colonial archive that was meant to erase, but I think accidentally or incidentally ended up recording their presence. And it's our job to actually forefront that presence and continue to actually reinterpret that presence in different ways. Same for museums as it is for archives.
Well, to quickly kind of expound on that, I'm curious about how maybe you hope, you talked about individuals accessing the archive and utilizing it. Do you have specific hopes and goals for maybe how the archive might be engaged by institutions like museums and like galleries, if any?
I keep talking about the fact that we are creating a well for artists, for writers, for poets, for playwrights, for scholars. My most important part is the descendant communities, but descendant communities can be all of those categories I just mentioned to draw from. We are collaborating with institutions. It's still hard, right? Like, I want to go to motherships like the Vatican and the British Library, the British Museum, the Smithsonian. I want to go to those small historical societies because they still have things. They have artifacts, they have stories, and they have documents. That in some cases, when we talk about artifacts, that those people who were enslaved or who were marginalized in some level created, but their descendants don't know about them, right? So I want to work with those institutions to actually do that. But it's tough because I think the impulse for institutions is not to share. So it's actually creating incentive. Part of my job is actually to talk about the synergies that can come from this, but to talk about the imperative. Why it's important for people to actually access this materials. And no, I actually don't want the artifact, just let's digitize it so that we can make it more accessible wherever people are in the world. I've been at that digital game for a very long time, since I was state historian, for 23 years or so. Trying to make the argument, going against the grain of both curators and archivists who have been institutionalized to not want to share, right? That's changing, and it's certainly, that's a generalization, and it's not true of many people, but I think the institutions, that's the impulse.
Thank you, thank you. That makes me wonder, from an artist's perspective, how can maybe institutions better support artists with these different voices, which I think we've touched on, but there's like this other element that I want to talk to you about with your work and artwork in general. Queerness adds this additional layer that we're talking about people with these different backgrounds and histories, and queerness adds, I think, another layer and another element. And Lehuauakea, I'm curious how queerness informs or is a part of your practice, and how that maybe adds a unique layer to what you do.
Yeah, so I think there's like two parts to that question, the queerness half, and then the first half is like, how can institutions be more supportive of shifting the narrative and supporting changes to that. I don't know, it's a lot, but one of the most positive experiences that I've had in recent years was a project called Displace, which was a curatorial vision between myself and my collaborator Kanani Miyamoto, which took place at the Five Oaks Museum in Portland, Oregon in 2020. And of course we had to shift the vision from a physical exhibition to becoming a virtual online exhibition, which in some ways increased accessibility, especially for our target audience, which was the Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and Hawaii to Pacific Northwest community. Because the history of our populations goes back, at least in documented modern history, to 1787. And so this exhibition wanted to ground that history, beginning with Hawaiians migrating from Hawaii up into the Pacific Northwest as part of the fur trade and early logging and salmon canning industries, and using that as kind of a foreground to talk about the ongoing movement of people, not just Native Hawaiians, but ongoing movement of people between Hawaii and the Pacific Northwest that continues to feed into our diaspora stories today. And this was an opportunity that the Five Oaks Museum gave to Kanani and I as guest curators. So instead of taking it upon themselves to tell these stories, which were not theirs to tell, neither of the curators at the time were of Pacific Islander or Native Hawaiian heritage, but they saw it as an opportunity to completely reframe the curatorial vision of the museum itself, to invite guest curators like myself and Kanani and many others who have followed in our footsteps to bring in the rest of our communities and give them a platform to tell our own stories. And there's a lot of trust that they put in our hands, and not only was that opportunity afforded to us, but they also gave us the support, the facilities, and even like the admin work to make it happen. I think that's something that needs to go hand in hand with institutional shift and that whole conversation, because it's one thing to say, hey, come into this space, here's an opportunity to tell your story. But it's a whole other thing to actually provide the means to do so. and not just do so by ourselves, but actually bring in our community from like kindergarten age all the way up to elders and everything in between. So that was something that was really positive, and I think a lot of institutions with similar models can use it as an example moving forward. And then on to the second half of your question, I think, you know, in a lot of ways, queerness does not inform so explicitly the ways that my work appears physically. From a historical standpoint, for those of you who might not be familiar, māhū in our culture is a term that we use to describe someone who is not kane or wahine, not male or female, but someone who is in the middle. And that's how I identify, and I think, you know, throughout history and even ongoing to this day, there's still a lot of stigma around māhū identity and what it means to be māhū, and that also went hand in hand with how I chose to move down my path as a lifelong apprentice of kapa making, or traditional bark cloth, which is what I have behind me. Historically, our māhū individuals and community had a very special place within social circles where oftentimes these were spiritual leaders, teachers, kumu as we call them, people held in high regard often because they embodied a very special place that was in the middle. And on the other hand, kapa making generally in most cases and most stages of the process was activity reserved for women. And not just the work itself, but the spaces that were where this activity was conducted was generally reserved just for women. But like a lot of other things, māhū were likely allowed to kind of fluidly move through these spaces and participate in kapa making, as well as other activities that were maybe just generally reserved for men. Like a lot of our tool making for kapa was reserved for men. And so you'd have men and women on both sides of the spectrum contributing to kapa making, but māhū occupying a place in the middle. And as someone who identifies as such, I think it was kind of a pivotal point in my practice where I decided that I wouldn't be making the kapa tools, like my beaters and things like that, out of necessity because I had to, because there wasn't at the time anyone to make those tools for me. But I instead chose to do so because it embodied a sense of how I felt internally gender-wise. And so not only was I making my own tools, but I was also using those same tools to create the kapa itself. So kind of embodying both sides of the work. And you'll see some practitioners these days who do everything as well, but don't identify as queer or or non-gender binary or māhū. But that's just out of, I think, necessity, because kapa making is still on the rise, and not everyone has access to people who can make the tools for them. So for me, doing kind of both sides of the work is a conscious choice rather than one made out of survival or necessity.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think it's so important to share that background and that aspect of your work. And part of why my question ended up being kind of two questions, I was jumping ahead to the queer element, because I feel like the queer element in conversations around racial and ethnic marginalization and cultural assimilation, the queer element gets segregated, I feel, or it gets overlooked, and that's an element that is complicated, right? Because yes, I wanted to ask you about this. I see you're like ready.
I'm ready.
Feel free, feel free.
Yeah. I want to sort of take a moment to even establish what queer is, thinking about the writings of Bell Hooks, for example, in which Hooks writes that queerness is not simply about who you have sex with. Queerness is part of a truly intersectional identity, that queerness is revolution. Queerness is prisons must be abolished, Palestine must be free. Queerness is a revolution started by trans women of color, in this country at least, and there are other histories. In Mexico we have thousands of years of mouhū culture, but queerness is really always intersectional, and so as much as the systems that be will try to parse out our identities and create these discrete categories, the fundamental, what is fundamentally queer is a way to understand these many aspects of oneself. And so I think that's something that's so present in this exhibition. There's a great piece upstairs that is in fact about the carceral industrial complex. If you haven't all seen it, it's a virtual reality. Maybe some of the people here want to speak about it. But there are so many works in this exhibition that really directly address the idea that queerness is an encompassing category. It's a world vision. It's a way to see and understand the world differently. And I think that's how it has so much to do with the visual arts. It literally allows you to envision another world, because the constraints of the traditional cishet patriarchal society open up. They get pushed upon. You can imagine a world and a way of living that's very different from all the ways that you have been guided. And I think that's something that is really important about what art does. It allows us to quite literally see differently, to envision different worlds. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's like a drop the mic. So
I also wanted to bring it up in context of the Native Bound Unbound archive. Just curious about any thoughts you might have regarding, when I think of, let's say, my descendants and when I try to navigate that history, sometimes information can be so kind of opaque, and queerness can be something that's hidden or coded or not so obvious, and maybe that is lost forever. But there's not really like ways where queerness maybe emerges through a name or through a bloodline. And I was just curious if you had encountered queerness in any way through stories, or through, if it does emerge in any way, or maybe it doesn't.
What a great question that I'm not sure I have an answer to. This is where I think about Emma's work again, about the decolonial imaginary, because sometimes we just have names, we have like baptisms, we have all of these documents that were created that are not from their perspective, right? By priests, by civic governors, all of these. And as much as I love them because we're recovering those names for other purposes, there's so much silence embedded in there, right? So, of their full experience, which is precisely Emma's point about like reimagining the arc of their full lives. And even though we're attempting to gather those documents, everything from a baptism all the way to a death, and their descendants' documents. But the question you have asked is like, can I start to perceive those two women that have been captured together, some sort of some intimacy formed. And I love that you've reminded us that bell hooks actually opened up the question about queerness, and that's more than that. That's more than that type of intimacy. And it's a good question for me to continue to look at and actually encourage the team to pull back the lines and imagine in a different way. I just want to pull up the threads of in the middle and the intersectionality. I mean, I've thought about that in terms of this work for a very long time. In fact, I prefaced 2 words that I thought that I wanted to reclaim theoretical, that are based in how we think about these identities. I used the term in my dissertation, entremetido, someone in the middle. And I also used the term malcriado, to actually talk about the fact that they have been raised Indian in the wrong place, and what that means to be displaced. They're not only detribalized, but they're displaced as Orlando Patterson would remind us, so that they will never ever know their ancestors. That to me is one of the core elements of slavery. And no matter how much, like others will even argue with me, well, they weren't technically called slaves. And, you know, I don't mean to mock that, because they're real arguments. There are laws that prohibited slavery, but at the end of the day, what I'm looking at are elemental pieces. Will they ever know their ancestors? Will they ever be able to pass that ancestry down to their children? They've been taken away from their homelands, their language, their traditions, all of those things. So those are the things I'm thinking about as we're recovering these projects. That's one thing. I want to speak about queerness, because I actually have not a lot. You know, you asked us to think about, like, is this a subject identity that is marginalized, particularly when we're talking about issues like this, about race, class, or other things? And the invitation to think about queerness in a much broader way is a really wonderful one for me to think about again. But, you know, at a very personal level, I've entered into all of these institutions. And I also grew up in a small town that is hard to be queer in, right? It's hard. It's actually impossible in a way that, to this day, every time I hear about someone who has killed themselves, I think, could that have been that? Could that have been, there's not the infrastructure in the community to support them saying, you are beautiful, you're powerful, you're in between, you can speak about intersectionality. But at a very core, I had to leave in order to become all of the things that I am, right? To be able to speak not only to race and class and caste and gender and sexuality. And it took me decades, actually, to recover, to actually find that strength in myself, only because I had a great-grandmother who actually embedded the core elements in me, but I couldn't have done it in the village. I actually came home. I actually left places in the city to come home, to come out, but I was already in my 30s. So, sorry, that was a personal, different element of what you asked later in our questions.
No, that precisely touches on, I think, a really crucial and critical element to this whole conversation, is that our own personal journeys with our identities and assimilation that are so multifaceted and multi-layered, that tie into both place through identity and sexuality, and also even just like timeline of where you happen to be with, like, you know, for example, I was born, I guess I'm second generation. My parents did not teach me Spanish because they, you know, were grown up. They were raised being beaten for speaking Spanish in school, and they wanted to raise me with the kind of different kind of cultural background to a degree so that I could succeed in terms that they had understood and they were indoctrinated with. And I was not aware of that until I was much kind of farther into my life, and you kind of realize, and then you add these other layers of queerness, being from a small New Mexican town to it. I kind of began to realize like how much I'm informed by cultural assimilation. Sometimes, not even knowingly, I'm already kind of like, oh, well, I'm already into my life this many years. And I didn't even realize I was making decisions or positioned in a way that's been informed by that. So my question then that I would like to address, since that you've talked about it to Lehuauakea and to Alexis, would be to share, if you feel comfortable, it's an option, your personal experiences with cultural assimilation. Yeah.
Is it okay? Yeah. So I was a little bit about like my background, which ultimately will inform the rest of my answer. I was born in Portland, Oregon, and that's where my parents had met and gone to college and started their life together, and then raised back home on the island of Hawaii, the Big Island. And I also have a lot of family history and genealogy tied to that island. And that's where I kind of got my cultural foundation as a Native Hawaiian, learning my language, our culture, our practices, our dance, and being around people like me. And right before I started high school, so around 13, 14 years old, my parents moved me back up to Oregon. And, you know, when you're at that age, it's already hard enough, like you're going through so many changes and trying to figure yourself out. And, you know, in a few years, you're an adult. And you throw on top of that being moved out of your element, out of your cultural home, and being placed into a white suburban neighborhood where there aren't very many Native Hawaiians or Pacific Islanders at all. That was really difficult for me, and you know, my whole life I had gone by my name, Lehuauakea, or Lehua for short, and I felt like, oh, it's going to be so hard for all these kids in school to know my name or even say it or spell it correctly. So I was also given an English name when I was born, and I shortened that to make it my own little nickname. And it was much more palatable for a white audience, which was most of my schoolmates at the time. And so that's what I went by for, I want to say, the better part of 8 years. Until I finished up college also in Portland. And at that point I had been assimilating for so long, and even just the act of calling myself by a different name, I think, is assimilation in a really messed up sense. You know, trying to, or at least, you know, feeling like my Hawaiianness wasn't going to be good to embody, feeling like it wasn't welcome there. And I didn't have any role models who could tell me otherwise at the time, because my parents too, my dad, who's the mixed Hawaiian one, he's very much assimilated too, so I didn't have anyone to tell me otherwise, to trust in my roots and to be empowered in that. And so once I started making kapa and started learning this practice and really going back to my roots and realizing that there was something missing after all those years of being called a different name, I changed back to being called Lehuauakea. And it felt so right. And you know, after years of not hearing my spirit not hearing that name for so many years by people who knew me and people who I've just met for the first time, it was like I was coming back home to myself. like experiencing both sides of assimilation and not assimilation. Yeah, there's a lot of work to do, and I think that informs a lot of the work that I do now as someone who is a Kanaka in the diaspora, someone of mixed heritage, someone who sits at all these different intersections of identity. I want to be able to use the platform that I have with my work to support kids who may be going through the same things that I did as a kid, similar experiences, similar backgrounds, feeling displaced, feeling like they don't belong, or feeling like they have to do other things beyond themselves to belong. That has become kind of a underlying driving force in the work that I do, just because I want those kids to have more than I did.
Yeah, I really relate to that statement. So as a mixed race, so white and Mexican, cis queer person, I started doing the work that I do because I couldn't find queer histories, I couldn't find Latinx histories. And I'm so grateful that I get to do the work that I get to do, because it's a constant reminder that the colonial, imperial, capitalist project is to normalize erasure and forgetting. And so I feel enormously appreciative that my job is actually to unlearn and constantly question so many, if not all, of the things that I was taught. And that's been the great impetus of my professional career as well. That's what I try to write books about and articles. And yeah, I feel very lucky to be in an in-between space, to inhabit lots of identities that essentially one could even call like unstable. That in-betweenness, as Gloria Ansaldúa always writes about, I think can be a real position of self-knowledge. Yeah, we've been historically always disregarded for our in-betweenness, for being malcriados, for being entremetidos. But that's, I think it's also, for me, claiming that place of not fitting in a lot of worlds, or only fitting in slightly, has been such a rich source of information and ways to question the way that one gets to be in the world, or to ever feel too confident in one's subject position or identity.
Can I just speak to one part of this? It's a process, right? And you know, I suppose maybe for some people it could be static, like you assimilate and you're there, but I don't think so. But at least my experience has been, it's a process, right? Like, I was a farm kid who didn't know I first generation, you know, I end up in UC Berkeley, like, but that was intentional. I wanted to go from a town that is 70 people in it, and we live in closer to the mountains, so like there are 5 houses. That's where I grew up, and so to something that little to something that, so I could get lost in it, right? But in getting, like, I remember my dad would say, once a borreguero will always smell like a borreguero. That is, you'll always smell like sheep. And I was like, I don't want to smell like sheep. I don't want to. And I assimilated. I dressed like I was not that country kid. I didn't want to be that country kid. My parents were also older. There was shame. I was embarrassed for the fact that but I'm speaking to a process, right? And so at some point in that arc of my own life, I was like, oh my God, why am I ashamed? Like, I learned my core values there. I hope I don't smell like a sheep, but I love lamb, right? All of those things that made me who I was, including the fact that at some point in that arc, and I didn't call it coming out, I called it gathering strength. And that gathering of strength, because coming out somehow felt white to me or something, like it felt like it wasn't my paradigm. And I've come to terms with that. But at that arc in my life, I was like, I need to gather the strength and know who I am. And you know, as I've seen people start to recover, reclaim their names, recover a sense of their past, there's critique from our community in those moments. And I think that's so bad. I'm not trying to bring a judge, but there's something that's harmful or something to the process of a person's recovering of themselves. So it's not just about assimilation, it's about recovery.
Wow, thank you. Thank you all for those really powerful and moving stories.
We just started, right?
I know. At this point, we're running tight on time, but I think we maybe have time for a couple questions from the audience. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to pass over the mic.
Mine is not really a question, but it's an affirmation for what you all have said. But I realized, looking at you, that you're all so much younger, and I went through all this 60 years ago. So the process continues, so that I'm sure the 15-year-old now is going through what I went through 60 years ago. And that whole issue of reclaiming and of changing oneself. And I too came from one of those teeny little villages. And I went to New York City. You went to Berkeley, I went to New York City at age 60.
Bigger.
So it's just a matter of remaking ourselves if it turns out that it's not working the way we wanted. And then one other thing I want to point out is you mentioned the idea that curators don't want to release some of their information. I was a curator for many years, and part of the reason that we don't want to do that is because you realize that it can be appropriated. And when it's appropriated, it can be used very badly.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say how grateful I am for intergenerational solidarity, for all the elders that we have, being queer to me has been such a gift because it completely allows me to rethink kinship and family structures. There can be so many fractional divisions of like how to be queer or any other identity category that one inhabits, and there are people who want to police and control and sort of impede this recovery. But I think this is such an important reminder that we have this incredible network amongst ourselves and all this rich history, that we have a major project to recover and honor, but it's really amazing and beautiful that it's all there for us.
Excuse me, I need to clarify something. The queer was not one of the things I was saying. Okay.
Fair enough, yeah.
Do we have, okay, got another question.
Hi everyone, this question is for anyone and everyone on the panel. My name is Kenny Alcomos. So, you know, I spent a lot of my professional career in predominantly white institutions, and just 3 years ago, a revelation happened when I joined the board of directors of a nationwide nonprofit called Arts Administrators of Color. And why even at the age of, I think, 36-ish at the time, this was a revelation for me was because I thought throughout so much of my career to that point, I just kind of had to deal with some of the issues surrounding assimilation and discomfort in predominantly white spaces. And that was just kind of my lot in life as someone who was Middle Eastern but born and raised in the United States. And you know, an organization like Arts Administrators of Color is really founded on the belief of creating for us and by us spaces. And my question to you all is, you know, I got into a conversation with one of my fellow friends of color not too long ago who said, like, I get the mission of organizations like AAC and the need for spaces that are for us and by us. But at some point, we're self-segregating, and at some point we need to come back into the kind of the reality of the fact that we live in a predominantly white country. So my question is, where do you see the value of for us by us spaces, and what should be the long-term goal of a for us by us space? Of course, the initial goal being comfort and safety in numbers among people with whom we have affinity, but in the long term, do you see a for us by us space being needed, 100 years from now in the United States, and what might that look like? Getting back, reintegrating ourselves and not feeling the need to have to kind of segregate ourselves based on certain affinities.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, the US is becoming less and less white dominant, and more of us are becoming more and more mixed. I guess there's pros and cons to that, but I like to look at it as a positive thing because it allows mixed individuals like myself to see things from so many different perspectives. And the idea of like a for us, by us space, I think, is something that has been increasingly at the forefront of a lot of Indigenous communities. And as an Indigenous person myself in the Native Hawaiian community, there's a lot of conversation around reclaiming spaces and mindsets and paradigms that were stolen from us or not afforded to us. That includes art spaces, but also education spaces, modes of organizing, connecting with community, and even things like food sovereignty. And I think at this point, those spaces are very much needing to be prioritizing Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders because we've had so much taken away from us. And I think, kind of to answer one part of your question about what I believe the goals of these for us, by us spaces should be is, at least from my perspective, for Indigenous oriented spaces, I think it's important that those kinds of institutions allow or continue to build opportunities and platforms for Indigenous communities and individuals and families to get our land back. Especially in Hawaii, with so much of our land being occupied by military operations and foreign landowners. There's a very limited and finite amount of our ancestral homelands for us to be on, and I think a lot of organizations back home in one way or another have at the forefront building cultural sovereignty and empowering our identity as contemporary Native Hawaiians to either get our land back, get our culture back, get our language back, not just from as adults, but raising that and instilling that in our younger generations and our kids from a very small age. And so, in 100 years, I don't know. I'm not sure if that's still going to be a goal that's needed at the forefront. As it stands, we've been illegally occupied for over 120 years. So maybe in 100 years, we still will be having these kinds of conversations, unfortunately. I'd like to think not. And beginning in the 70s or so, there's been a growing movement of empowered Native Hawaiian individuals. And, the younger generations are getting more and more frustrated, I think I'd say, about the state of things. And as more comes to light with unfortunate events like the fires on Maui recently, looking deeper at the histories that have literally fueled those tragedies and continue to do so, has opened the eyes of a lot of people, Hawaiian and non-Hawaiian. So I think the spaces like For Us, By Us spaces are going to continue to be needed, and putting Hawaiian lands back in Hawaiian hands, as they say. So that's my take on it.
I wanted to offer perhaps a different way to frame the situation, rather than For Us, By Us spaces being those of segregation, rather that they are instead sites of solidarity building, and those who want to get on board can, but that we are not built for their ways of being and for their structures. So going back to those like practical ideas about what institutions could do who want to work against the forced cultural assimilation. I think one practical solution is to, as you talked about, hire people from communities to, and when I say community, I mean both in terms of identity and people doing the work with the community. So hire people from communities to conceptualize projects, to set the agenda, and to hold positions of power. And that this is important. I think these For Us, By Us projects are incredibly important. I think the ways that we understand ourselves in relation to the world provide us sources of inspiration, of direction, and I don't think that we're cutting ourselves off from other ways in the world, but we're rather more powerfully inhabiting who we are. Yeah.
All right, I think we're at time. Thank you all so much for coming to this conversation, and thank you to our wonderful 3 panelists. It was insightful and moving, so I appreciate it. The exhibition, like I said earlier, is up through December 30th. We're open Tuesday through Saturday, noon to 5. And our next event is going to be Queer in Color. It will be a poetry reading in collaboration with the Syndicate and the UNM African American Student Services. And that will be next Thursday, October 26th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Thank you all and have a good afternoon.